I think if we cast our minds back to general elections for the last 50 years, and as a young child in this country in 53, I remember the general elections that came one after the other. And I remember one of the things that really hit me hard was at the beginning of the election, we usually had some court jester would spring out on the national stage and say the word immigration. They've come for your jobs. They've come for your houses. They've come to take over. This is a tiny minority. And from then onwards, the election was determined by immigration, and we black and brown people felt like we were focused upon for that period of time, and very nervous for that period of time, because that's usually in the 50s and 60s, name calling and all those kind of things happened. That affected me quite a lot. And what it was telling me all the time was about racism. And I began thinking about what was racism, where did this racism come from? When it got to somewhere in the mid-60s, and they started talking about the Race Relations Act. And of course, as soon as people heard about the Race Relations Act, everybody calmed down and thought, well, a Race Relations Act is surely going to make things better. And I started thinking about it then. I just left navigation school, nautical college, and getting ready to go to sea because I want to become a navigator. And I couldn't understand why a simple act of a Race Relations Act was going to make any difference. And what I began to realize is a Race Relations Act, all it could do was paper over or plaster over, put a plaster on a very deep wound, which would make no difference because that wound needed to be cleaned out and stitched up, not plastered over. So I then went back to the beginning and thought, I'd like to write a book about slavery. And of course, I was too frightened because I just thought it was a daunting task. And such a daunting task I didn't want to take on. So I was just thinking of this is going to take years. Wasn't prepared for that. But still, round about late 60s, Mr. Enoch Powell danced onto the stage, where he'd been on the stage already as Minister of Health. He had had an office out in Bridgetown, Barbados, which had been an office for recruiting nurses. And there was one for recruiting London Transport as well, and a variety of other transport facilities throughout Britain. And he was also the person who then issued those very famous words, rivers of blood. And I just thought he was basically relying on the previously ingrained attitudes, previously ingrained notions, dumped with a dollop of fear, and that would allow him to hold the center stage. And remember, Enoch Powell was this man who we were told he was important. He understood Greek. I mean, he studied the classics, ancient Greek. He spoke Latin, but he may have done all that, but he had no humanity. In order to have anything to do with writing about slavery, we needed to know about ships and shipping. And I was on a ship, and I was understanding shipping. And because of that, that's what really got me into the understanding that once I got there, I would be on the West African coast, the very coast where all the forts and the castles of the British slave trade, where they were. So I started studying them. And I started studying them because I wanted to understand what had happened to the black man and the white man together. There we had this man subjugated another. With that subjugation, what went with it was inferiority was denoted to the, was given to the black. Superiority was taken, acquired by the white. These are two attitudes that started then, that has lived through with us till today. And that inferiority status that was conferred on the black man and woman went throughout the whole, from Africa to the Caribbean, who used to relentlessly have their children sold. Once they'd had a child, that child was sold. Why? Because they were inferior people. And why were they inferior people? Because they came from that place in Africa where they had no culture, no intellect, no language to speak of, and they used to just wander around sleeping all day, doing nothing. And that notion, remember, that notion was taken on, was created by a minority of white people, and that minority were the ones who owned the slaves, owned the ships, owned the plantations. And when we came here, we met them again because this is where all the profits came to. And I wanted to write a story about that triangular trade.
I've got it here, and I've got a very nice message in it. To Jeremy Corbyn, for all our children, Remi Kapo, 14th November 2019. As you might recall, I was quite busy in November 2000. There was an election campaign going on, and clearly it wasn't going to be possible to read very much during the election campaign, although I did read a bit. I then read it very thoroughly, and then Remi, when I gave the Bernie Grant Memorial Lecture, gave me a copy of Torrents of Fire, an abolitionist tale, which is the second part of the trilogy. And I've been absolutely fascinated by it. And I also have read a lot of African history over the years, but this to me was the most evocative, the most realistic, and deserves a wide audience, because the descriptions of the way in which slaves were treated, both in the hunting of slaves in Guinea and on the ships when they were loaded up and sent across to Jamaica and other places, and then the insurance fiddles where slaves died and the company still got paid by the insurance companies. So they didn't die, they were murdered by the process. And I'm also a great fan of this man, Richard Hart, who's was a friend of mine. He's passed on. A great friend of mine who wrote Slaves Who Abolished Slavery, 2 volumes, Blacks in Bondage and Blacks in Rebellion, and that fits in with so much with what Remi wrote. Because when slavery is discussed in school, our children are taught that slavery was a bad thing. They all accept that. And it was a terrible thing, and it was shocking. And it was William Wilberforce and the liberals, small L liberals, who got rid of slavery by legislation. I mean, it's total nonsense. Slavery was, the slave trade was abolished, and then slavery was later abolished in a legal form because of the rebellions. And Richard Hart's book points out that the rebellion in Western Jamaica in the early 19th century, the burning of the great houses and the storage places for the sugar cane and the burning of crops and so on, caused damage amounting to over £1 million. £1 million in the early 19th century. And what's brilliant about Remi's book is it goes back to the chit-chat of London financiers saying there's been another uprising in Jamaica. We've lost another estate. They didn't think why there was an uprising. They probably knew. And the way in which slavery was so intrinsic to the British economy. And later, Dr. Eric Williams, who was later to become the first Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago on independence in 1962, wrote Capitalism and Slavery, in which he listed, and I remember buying this book when I first came to live in London in the late 60s, buying this book and being very impressed with it. And indeed, I'd read a bit about it when I lived in Jamaica before that. And what Eric did was point out that Barclays Bank, that Lloyds Bank, and so on and so on and so on, and of course, Tate and Lyle and all the others, the origins of all these companies and all these wealth was the slave trade. And what Remi's book shows is that the House of Commons, a deeply corrupt institution, and a very small membership, and the total electorate, as John Wilkes, one of the few radical members of Parliament, pointed out, for the whole of England was 5,000 in the early 19th century. And most of them were either slave owners or were related to families that made a lot of money out of the slave trade. Hence, they concocted for themselves this massive amount of compensation, £20 million, I think. Remi will correct me if I'm wrong on the figure, somewhere about that. And that was a massive contribution to Britain's national debt. And I only discovered recently, through my good friend Patrick Vernon, this was only finally paid off in 2015, the debt in that. And the argument in the early 19th century was slavery is important because it maintains the economy. The sugar economy is crucial to us. Get involved in human rights and abolish slavery, then the whole economy will crash. But what Remi's book also does is describes the way in which people who were white sailors, white overseers, white people working in lots of different places related to the sugar trade in various ways, and indeed, for that matter, the rum trade and the brandy trade and all the others, points out that you have to get a sense of anesthetized superiority over somebody else in order to be so brutal towards them.
In terms of the brutality, I found that really, really hard, because here I was. I remember the first time I was going to have a slave whipped. And remember, I'm black, I'm a writer, I'm Nigerian, I'm Yoruba, I'm the writer. But in this, I have to be both white and black, because I was writing it, I'm also writing it for a black and a white audience. I wanted to write the first book that actually pulled both readers, white and black readers, onto the same page all the way through. And I realized that I was going to have to do some whipping. And I cried the first time I had to do that whipping. It took me 2 or 3 days to work my way around to it, to actually, and this was really, it was all this metaphorical, but here am I have to whip a slave, and the rape, I have to be a woman, and I have to imagine all this. I spoke to a lot of women during that time. I spoke to a lot of women. I read Sarah Brown Miller's book on rape, so that I could really get into the mindset. It's basic. What I'm saying is you have to be terribly honest with your writing and with yourself. You really do have to be brutally honest. And there's some side, and you see some things, and you're going to do some things which you don't like doing, but you know in order to advance the story, you have to do it. And so I find in the juxtaposition between the tenderness and the brutality and the depictions of the beautiful scenarios and everything, that is what is going to make the book, because that's what slavery was about. While people were standing on a ship, taking away those slaves, and the Church of England priests were standing on the shoreline, giving a benediction, and some of the officers were looking at the landscape as it's going away. So I've got two eyes now, two sets of eyes. I've got one of the officers watching this landscape disappear, and I've got another one of the slaves seeing their homeland for the last time. And they probably knew they were never going to see their homeland again. And I cried again. I mean, that book, Reap the Forgotten Harvest, I cried many times because I put myself into the position of those slaves. And I put myself, and I would imagine what it must have been like for them to land in a foreign land. I could not even use Jamaica, Trinidad, or any of those, because I knew people. I've got friends from all those islands. I couldn't bring myself to, because I would be almost like insulting them, because they could easily turn around to me and say, it didn't go like that. So I invented an island.
I do think that oral history tradition is a very important one, because anything before the 19th century, the majority of the population in every country in the world was actually functionally illiterate in the sense of being able to write. Therefore, it was the oral tradition that was the only way we would understand the lives of people other than the ruling class.
When I go to the Caribbean, I have tears in my eyes, because I'm saying that these people went through so much, and what have they got for it? They've got loads of these tourist settlements, most of whom are buying their holidays and paying for their holidays in Britain or in France or whatever. And then they go and and the people there are doing all the cleaning and the cooking and so on and so forth. And I'm thinking, whose island is it?
I think an apology is important, and I would have wanted to have given one, but it's got to be backed up by action. It's got to be backed up by a change in attitude. It's not just mouthing a few platitudes. It is something very, very serious. And the structural issues facing the Caribbean are partly structural debt. Haiti, the most indebted place and poorest place in the world, was indebted from the moment the nation was born when Toussaint Louverture overthrew the French. And it's been indebted ever since. And the underpayment for primary goods exported from the Caribbean, and the investment, which Remi pointed out, into hotels, the profits of which go to the USA, to France, to Germany, to Britain, and so on. Cameron went to Jamaica while he was Prime Minister, and the issue of reparations was raised, so he offered to help with the building of a prison.
That's what I remember.
With you there. But I think the reparations movement is an important one. It's important in terms of support and help and aid, but it's also important in terms of trade and important in terms of debt that goes with it. And so I was very pleased that Senator Bernie Sanders and others have launched a campaign for writing off debt for the southern countries as a result of COVID and so on, which I've supported this particular demand that he's made. And so if we understand the history, we understand where the fundamental injustice has come from. If we understand where that injustice has come from, we empower ourselves to put it right. And so the learning of history from the story of the reality and the complexities of human life and all the confusions that go with it. And Remi, your books are doing a great job in helping people to understand that. And at the end of it, I felt sad, I felt angry when I'd read your books, but I also felt empowered with more knowledge. Remi, thank you very much.